is the outside of the Wrigley building is actually tiled. It's covered in more than 250,000 enameled terracotta tiles, which gives it that lovely color gradient, getting lighter as you go up, and it also makes the Wrigley building more fireproof. Fire is unfortunately a big part of Chicago's history. We'll talk more about the Great Chicago Fire later on. One disadvantage to having your building covered in tiles is they're too delicate to be power washed, so once a year all those tiles have to be scrubbed by hand. After this bridge, we're going to take a look at the second tallest building in Chicago. Straight ahead, the Trump International Hotel and Tower from 2009. Today, the Trump Tower, straight ahead, is the second tallest building in Chicago. You're going to see it has 3 horizontal black strips going across it at places where the building gets narrower. Those are called setbacks, and their height is no coincidence. That first setback is actually the same height as the roof of the Wrigley building. It's 2009, saying hello to 1924. This is a great example of a modern style called contextualism, as in context, ways for buildings to flow with the context around them. In this case, the height of each of those 3 setbacks corresponds to the height of a different older building nearby. Trump Tower was designed by a Chicago architect, Adrian Smith, also known as the world's tallest architect, because he designed the tallest building in the world, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai. To help picture the tallest building in the world, picture 2 of Trump Towers stacked on top of each other. About twice the height of Trump Tower. That's about the height of the tallest building in the world, which was designed by the same architect, Adrian Smith, from right here in Chicago. We'll go over on the left. Up ahead, you're going to see a stone building with short towers on the corners and the central dome in the middle. The Jewelers Building. When it was completed in 1926, that was the tallest building west of New York City. There used to be a lot of jewelry companies in there. In the 20s, those were Al Capone's days. A lot of organized crime. So if a jeweler was worried about getting robbed, they did not have to leave their car, because the Jewelers Building had an automobile elevator. You could drive your car with your jewelry into the building. They take you, your vehicle, and your jewelry up to any of the first 27 floors. Unfortunately, that automobile elevator is no longer in service, partly just because cars got too big. Also, if you've seen the movie Batman Begins, Batman spent some time brooding in front of one of those corner towers on the top corner of the Jewelers Building. Let's do one from the 1960s. If you're a fan of the band Wilco, you'll recognize this as one of their album covers. Coming up on the right after this bridge, you're going to see 2 of the most photographed buildings on the river. These 2 round, white, sort of corncob or hive-shaped buildings ahead on your right. The Marina City Towers, 1968. Their architect Bertrand Goldberg said there are no straight lines or sharp corners in nature, therefore our buildings should have none. So you get this very round, natural design. Goldberg's goal was to create a city within a city. You could live in your apartment above, park your car in the garage below, dine in the restaurant below that. There was an ice skating rink, a bowling alley, a laundromat. You could even park your boat in the marina underneath. At the time these were built, in the 1960s, the river was still very industrial. There was a lot more factories. The river back then was smelly. Not a lot of people wanted to live right by the river. So since these were some of the first big residential buildings on the river, they had to include anything its residents could possibly want. A city within a city. The fact that these were a success helped convince the city it was a good idea to keep cleaning up the river. The river's gotten cleaner and cleaner. Today we have a lot more residential buildings on the Chicago River. I actually got to go to a New Year's Eve party in one of those towers. And on New Year's, there were barges on the river that shoot off fireworks. So I got to watch fireworks going off while I was above them. It was pretty cool. Probably the best thing I got out of that relationship. Over on the left, that short concrete building with the gold 5.5 is 55 West Wacker. It's also from 1968, but a very different style called brutalism, or architecture in the raw. The late 60s were a tumultuous time, and certain businesses and institutions wanted to convey a sense of stability and authority. So they built these heavy fortress-like buildings with exposed concrete and small inset windows. It's a style that came and went pretty quickly in the late 1960s, but it's a style you'll see on a lot of government buildings, university campuses, and libraries. A style called brutalism, architecture in the raw. Now for contrast to that heavy fortress, the next one on the left is going to be an elegant glass skyscraper. We're going to follow those white granite columns all the way up to the roof. You'll see the roof looks like an ancient Greek temple. Kind of looks like the Parthenon in Athens, stretched out into a glass skyscraper. This is 77 West Wacker. It's a style called neoclassical. It's a new take on classical, ancient Greek design. It's pretty cool from a time perspective. We're here in 2023, looking at a building from 1992, which is itself a reference all the way back to ancient Greece. Feel free to take as many pictures as you like. It'll be pretty much non-stop photo ops on a gorgeous day like today, but I'll be sure and try to give you a heads up if I see any extra special photo opportunities. Just a reminder to keep your camera inside the railing. And if you want to stand up and take group photos, we're going to give you a photo break near the end of the tour when we're out by Navy Pier. That'll be a great time to stand up and take pictures, but for now we appreciate you taking pictures from your seats so we're not blocking anybody's view. And then we'll finish the tour at the same place where we started. All along beside us on the left here, we have the Chicago River Walk, built in the early 2000s at a cost of $112 million. Each section of the river walk between the various sets of bridges is called a room, and each room has its own unique style and character. The room to our left right now is known as the River Theater, named for those steps like you would have in an ancient amphitheater. It's pretty cool how they have the trees going right out of the steps, right there. The idea of having a river walk on the Chicago River has been around for a while, at least as early as 1909, but construction on the river walk did not start until the early 2000s, around 2006. That was all part of a plan called the Burnham Plan. It's an architect named Daniel Burnham made a plan for the whole city back in 1909. That plan is also the reason we have our lovely public access lakefront. If you've been on the lakefront, you've seen a lot of parks and beaches instead of private developments. It's another feature of the Burnham Plan. We'll talk more about that later on. The next wide stone building on the left is called the Builders Building. It was actually built into sections. See if you can spot the difference. The wide section on the left, called the stripy pillars near the bottom, is from 1927. And the narrow section on the right, with the dark bay windows that protrude out, was added on in 1986. That's a nearly 60-year time jump, all within one building, the Builders Building, 1927 and 1986. This next bridge, the Wells Street Bridge, was originally built in 1922 and then replaced with an exact replica in 2013. So it looks like a bridge from the 20s, but it's actually pretty new. We talked about how in the early 1920s, American architects were still trying to figure out their own unique sense of style and beauty. Well, in the late 1920s, they found their own unique American architectural style, and it's called Art Deco. When you hear Art Deco, think Roaring 20s. We'll see a lot of great examples of Art Deco today. Perhaps our best example is this next one coming up on the right. This huge stone building on your right from 1929 is the Merchandise Mart. This Art Deco style was all about optimism in our machine-made future. We get that sense of optimism from all the straight line columns on the way up, just like we felt we were on the way up. And there's kind of a machine feeling to it. A lot of repetitive patterns, like the arrows in the trim, the gold squares punched into the wall. Feels like something off of an assembly line. See this row of statue heads right there by the river? Those were added in 1953 by Joseph Kennedy, father of former President John F. Kennedy. The Kennedys owned the Merchandise Mart for many years. Those 8 bronze busts are what's called the Merchant Princes, big Chicago businessmen who shaped the city's history and the world of business in general. F.W. Woolworth, A. Montgomery Ward, Marshall Field, for whom the Field Museum of Natural History is named. We'll talk more about the Merchandise Mart on the way back, how big it is, what they used it for. But for now, eyes up, cameras up. After this bridge, you're going to have one of your best views on the tour. We're approaching the junction of the 3 branches of the Chicago River. A lot of our newest skyscrapers in the last 10 years or so have been built right here. If you were here a decade ago, you would have been looking at a lot more parking lots. Today, you're looking at Chicago's trophy case. Welcome to Wolf Point. And that's some great timing. On the bridge ahead to your left, the Lake Street Bridge, you see one of our public transit CTA trains. One of our public transit trains, colloquially known as the L train, short for elevated train, EL. Not the letter L, because they're up and up above the roads. If I'm in the front of your picture, I'll try to make it look like I was really guiding it up. So like I said, this is Wolf Point, the junction of the 3 branches of the Chicago River. We're leaving the main branch. We'll do a quick excursion up the north branch, and then we'll head way down the south branch, see the Willis Tower on the way back. Straight ahead is a building with a big arch at the bottom. It's River Point from 2017. It actually sits directly above active Amtrak and Metro train lines. If you look at the stone wall below the building, there's circles in the wall there. Those are vents. There's fans spinning in there, letting air out from the trains that run right underneath that building. The newest addition to our skyline is directly to your right, Salesforce Tower, brand new office building. It's about 95% leased up. And to the left of that, that greenish building is an apartment building, Wolf Point West from 2016. Both of these sit on land owned by the Kennedys. Most of the buildings we'll see today are either apartment or office buildings. An easy trick to tell the difference: if there's any windows cracked open or balconies, that's probably an apartment building. If there are no windows cracked open or balconies, that's probably an office building. Straight ahead of the boat, on the left side, that shorter brick building is the oldest building we'll talk about on the river today. The Fulton House is from 1898. It was originally a freezer for the meatpacking industry. Chicago was a big hub for the meatpacking industry. They would slaughter cattle in the stockyards around the city, bring them here to be frozen and shipped off on trains. Then in the 1970s, they turned them into apartments. Take a look at those balconies on the far left side. You see the white space on the outside of those balconies? It shows you just how thick the walls of that freezer were. They say when the meatpacking industry moved out in the 1970s, it took the Fulton House 3 months to thaw out. Straight ahead on the right, this bridge sticking up in the air is the Carroll Street Railroad Bridge from 1908. It's no longer in use, it's a landmark, but it gives us a nice demonstration of how these movable bridges work. By a movable bridge, I mean they can raise. Chicago has the second most movable bridges of any city in the world, Amsterdam being number 1. The technical term is a bascule trunnion bridge. It's a fancy word for seesaw. On the back of the bridge, see that big concrete block? That's the counterweight. When the block goes down, the bridge stands up. All 37 of our movable bridges have counterweights. Most of those counterweights are buried out of sight, but the Carroll Street Railroad Bridge is kind enough to demonstrate. On your left, those pointy residences are the River Cottages, 1988. Their architect, Harry Weiss, was a huge fan of sailing and triangles. The whole building's kind of shaped like a sail. Everyone thought Harry Weiss was crazy for this one, not just for the odd triangular shape of the building, but for the fact he wanted to put residences on the river at all. Also directly to the left, really cool bird. I don't know what that is, stork, egret? That's nice. That's for me. The buildings are over here. That bird's never there. That's cool. The River Cottages, 1988. Back then, the river was still smelly. Not a lot of people wanted to live right here, but in the long term, Harry Weiss was right. A few years ago, one of those 4 units sold for $2.25 million. The river's now some of the most sought after real estate in the city. So our captain is going to do a U-turn here on the North Branch of the Chicago River, so we can go explore the South Branch. This is a great little break. If you need to use the bathrooms, they are downstairs. Men's room is downstairs on that side. Women's room is on that side. Downstairs, you'll also find our bar. We got bottled water, soft drinks, alcohol, chips, pretzels, coffee, tea, anything you might need. It is a card-only bar, no cash. My name is Michael. I'll be coming around, make sure everybody can hear me all right. If you have any questions, need any recommendations, let me know. I'll be back on the mic after we turn around. Bridges to raise. If you get a chance to watch it, I highly recommend it. It's a very impressive sight. It's quite the feat of engineering. The Carroll Street Railroad Bridge, this one sticking up in the air on your left. Like I said, it's a landmark from 1908. It's no longer in use. Obviously, there's no railroad here anymore, but this railroad actually used to run all the way out to Navy Pier, out by the lake, which we'll see later on. And this spot on the river is also the original site of the first footbridge we built across the river in the early 1800s, which was built to access a tavern. Up ahead on the right, that curving gray building is the Riverbend Condominiums from 2003. You see how the front of that building curves inward? And if you look ahead to the next blue glass building beyond it, River Point, you see how the front of that building curves out? Well, if you're into geometry, it's actually the same radius. Mathematically, the amount that the first building curves in is the same amount the next building curves out. It's another great example of contextualism. When they built that glass building, River Point, they acknowledged their context and they curve just like their neighbor. And both buildings are also imitating the curve of the Chicago River as well. Here's where I'll point out the color of the water. Notice as we're coming off the North Branch, it's got more of a typical river color, kind of this brownish hue. And you can see where it meets the water coming off of the main branch of the Chicago River. See that water on the main branch is a lighter blue color? That's because that's the water coming off of Lake Michigan. And in recent years, the color of Lake Michigan has changed due to an invasive species of zebra mussels. It's a type of mollusk. It's been eating algae and other small organisms. It's actually changed the color of Lake Michigan, and by extension, the color of the main branch of the Chicago River. Keep an eye on the Lake Street Bridge straight ahead. If we're lucky, we might get another nice photo op of an L train going over the top. That bridge, the Lake Street Bridge, is from 1918. It's actually due for construction. There'll be some renovations starting in 2024. You might have heard downtown called the Loop. That is a reference to those trains. Or CTA trains start on the outside, converge in the middle of downtown, they do a loop, and then head back out to the respective branches. So we generally call downtown the Loop. Off to your left, a lovely main view of the main branch of the Chicago River. Nice picture on your left. In particular, I'll point out the Marina City Corn Cob Towers. A lot of famous stunts have been done off that parking garage, including in Steve McQueen movies and the Blues Brothers. So we're crossing Wolf Point. We're leaving the north branch of the Chicago River. We're going to start heading south on the south branch. Up ahead on the right, you'll see a building with a Y-shaped foundation. You see how that one pinches together at the bottom? Now, why would you want to build a foundation like that? Well, this is actually a really tricky place to put a skyscraper. That lot sat empty for about 50 years because they had to find a way to fit the foundation in between two things. On the one side, there's Amtrak and Metro trains that run underneath. On the other side, a city zoning law required them to leave 30 feet of space between the river and the front of the building for public access, so people can enjoy walking by the river. So they had to squeeze that foundation into only 20% of the lot space. That foundation is about twice as wide as this boat. The first full-size floor of that building is about 100 feet off the ground. How do you do that safely? A lot of concrete. You ever see those rotating concrete trucks? It took about 500 of those to pour the foundation for 150 North Riverside. From 2017, it's another of our newer buildings from Wolf Point. You'll be able to see some of that concrete in the foundation underneath on your right. It also goes much further down into the ground than we can see here. And if you look up into the angled glass underneath, you can see a reflection of our boat. See if you can spot yourself in the reflection up there. Now, skyscrapers are actually designed to sway in the breeze. It's true, you don't want them to be too rigid, but you also don't want them to sway too much. So in this tour, I'll tell you about 3 methods of sway reduction, how we calm down skyscrapers swaying in the breeze. The first, you can't see them, but on the top floor of that building to your right, there are 12 tanks holding 160,000 gallons of water. Basically, when the wind makes the building sway one way, all the water sloshes the other way. That helps reduce the amount of time it takes the building to settle, which is important, because that's an office building, and that can mean the difference between hitting reply and accidentally hitting reply all. Thanks, I'm really proud of that joke. We're gonna go over on the left. This next blue glass skyscraper is called the Bank of America building. It's from 2021. This building cost around $800 million to construct. You'll notice it's got these blue ridges on the side. Those help shave off the wind step by step. They also have very reflective glass. Get a really clear view of the sky and its neighbors bouncing off the front face of the Bank of America building. This is also the headquarters for the Chicago Marathon, which is owned by the Bank of America. The Bank of America building had to deal with that same zoning law requiring them to leave 30 feet of space between the river and the front of the building. You can see how they dealt with that with these tripod legs, those steel I-beams. It kind of look like a chicken's footprint. Lift the 3rd floor and beyond up off the ground so people can enjoy walking along by the river. Now, like I said earlier, I call my tour a tour of time. So, it's convenient. The next 5 buildings on the right are going to be in chronological order. Let's go through some different phases of Chicago's architectural history. We'll start on the right with 2 North Riverside Plaza. Much like the Merchandise Mart, it's another Art Deco building from 1929. Made of the same material as the Merchandise Mart, this is polished Indiana limestone. This is originally home to the Chicago Daily News. A lot of famous writers worked in this building, including Carl Sandburg and Joseph Pulitzer. Take a look at those columns along the bottom of the building. In between the tops of those columns, there are carvings. Those bas-reliefs tell the story of the written word, from the hieroglyph to the Gutenberg printing press. And speaking of hieroglyphs, closer to the river, see those circular white lights with the stone obelisks between them? This was built right around the time they discovered King Tut's tomb, which caused a craze in American architecture of including Egyptian elements. That's why you see those stone obelisks on the wall by the river. So this is Art Deco, a fancy style from the Roaring '20s. Now at the end of the Roaring '20s, we had the Great Depression and then World War II. And those 20 years or so are kind of a gap in the architectural record. We weren't building a lot of new big buildings. So when we emerge in the post-war period, those experiences have changed our mindset. And that's how you get a new style called black box modernism. On your right, Gateway 1 from 1965 and Gateway 2 from 1967. Black box modernism is all about simplicity and efficiency. We got rid of the more decorative Art Deco style. Now we're just trying to be as efficient as possible. These are people that had lived through the Great Depression. They did not want to waste anything. It was a style pioneered by a German architect, Mies van der Rohe, who led the Bauhaus school in Germany, came here and designed over 40 of Chicago's skyscrapers. Once you start noticing these black box buildings, you'll see them all over town. The most famous example of this style, black box modernism, is also the tallest building in Chicago. You can just see the top corner to your left there, the Willis, formerly Sears Tower. We'll get a great view of that on the way back, and I'll talk about it for a long time. Mies van der Rohe actually coined the phrase, less is more, all about keeping it simple. He viewed these office buildings as machines made for working in. Sounds like a fun guy. Each of these black box buildings has three basic ingredients: skeleton, skin, and space. The skeleton is the steel frame on the inside that does most of the work holding up the building. The skin is the outside. This is what we call a curtain wall, as opposed to a load-bearing wall. Other buildings might have more stone or brick along the outside, bearing the load of the building. In this case, the steel skeleton on the inside does that, so the outside is more of a covering. It's what we call a curtain wall. And a third ingredient is the space. These can be very serious looking, kind of intimidating buildings. One thing that makes them a little more welcoming is they usually leave some space around the outside of the building for a plaza. If you're ever on that outdoor space beside one of these buildings, the grout lines, the lines in the sidewalk, often line up exactly with the window frames. So we need Gateway 1 and 2. This next white box on the right is Gateway 3 from 1971. So now we're moving along in time. We're getting a little bit more decorative. Now it's not just a steel box. Now we cover the outside with this precast sandy concrete. Gateway 3 is built in what's called the international style. The idea they were going for here is that you could put this building in any city in the world and it would fit in international style. So in Gateway 1, 2, and 3, as you might be able to guess, this next curving glass building ahead on the right is Gateway 4 from 1983. So now it's the 1980s. We got big hair bands. We're ready to show off again. We got new materials with which to show off. Now we have the ability to curve our glass, just like the river curves. Another great example of contextualism. Also, I just think this is funny. On the right, you got a fitness center right next to a bakery. One is a place I push my body to the limit every morning, and the other one is a fitness center. This next black box building on the left is called 300 South Wacker. Now, we actually did not used to talk about this building very much on the tour. It used to be kind of just another black box building. That is until a few years ago. The owners of the building spent $800,000 to put a giant map on the side of the building. If you look about halfway up, you're going to see a red Lego brick looking shape. That's this building. You can see the shape of the river beside it, the junction of the river up above. It's basically a giant "You Are Here" sign. They put themselves on the map by putting a map on themselves. Now, any fans of Batman might recognize this next stone building ahead on the right. In the movie The Dark Knight, that was Gotham City Bank. The heist at the beginning of The Dark Knight with the school buses was filmed right there. School buses went along Van Buren Street, and the Joker and his henchmen took zip lines from that glass building, Gateway 4, onto the roof of that stone building. That stone building is actually the old Maine Post Office, 1932. At the time of its completion, this was the largest post office in the world. Why did Chicago need such a big post office? Well, it used to be a major hub for mail order catalogs. If you ordered something from a Sears catalog back in the day, there's a good chance it was processed in this building. The post office moved to a smaller facility. It sat empty for a few years. Then in 2016, developers spent about $900 million to turn it into corporate offices for Pepsi and others. And they also turned the roof of this building into a 3-acre park. There are basketball courts up on that roof, walking trails, pickleball courts, even beekeepers, all on the roof of the old post office. Unfortunately, I don't think that park is open to the public, so if any of you work in that building, please let me know. I really want to go up there. Now, this next stretch of the river, as we're heading south, is story time. And the story I'm going to tell you is called The 4 Stars of Chicago. Alternate title, That Time We Accused a Cow of Arson. Now, it's a long story, and to tell it, I need to take a long sip of water. We got some big fans of hydration. Love to see it. All right, the 4 Stars of Chicago, or That Time We Accused a Cow of Arson. We'll start with the Chicago flag. Here it is. I'm holding it up. Let's talk about what our city flag means. The 2 blue stripes on the Chicago flag represent the Chicago River and Lake Michigan. The 3 white sections represent the 3 sides of the city: the south side, the west side, and the north side. Of course, there is no east side of Chicago, because on the east side you have Lake Michigan. So if somebody ever tells you they're from the east side of Chicago, they might be a duck. That's my favorite joke on the tour. The 4 red stars represent significant moments in Chicago's history: the fort, the fire, the fair, the fair. The first star is the fort, Fort Dearborn, the original settlement from the early 1800s. The fort is no longer there, but I'll point out its original site later on. The second star is the fire. We got a time machine? Let's go there now. It's October 8, 1871. The city is dry. We've not had a drop of rain for 14 straight weeks. The city is also wooden. Some of our streets and sidewalks were even made of wood. The river back then was so polluted and oily, parts of the river itself were flammable. And to top it all off, on today, October 8, 1871, we have wind of up to 30 miles an hour. This is a bad combination. About 4 blocks to the right, or to the west of where we are right now, a fire breaks out in Miss Catherine O'Leary's barn. Quickly gets across the river and burns through 4 miles of the city north. Let's jump ahead about 30 hours to when the fire finally burns out. It has destroyed around 18,000 buildings. More than 100,000 people lost their homes. More than 300 people lost their lives. One of the biggest urban fires ever. Front page news all over the world. Now, people want answers. Rumors are going around because we know where the fire started, but we don't know how. The most popular rumor you find in a newspaper. They say there was a cow in the barn that kicked over a lantern, started the fire. Which kind of makes sense when you think about it. Chicago was the meatpacking capital of the world. Maybe some cow finally got grass fed up, decided to take matters into her own hooves and settle her beef once and for all. Yeah, I know the cow jokes are cheesy. I'll try not to milk it. Yeah, I'd say on the whole these work about 2% of the time, so. Well, it's half and half. Alright, let's skim ahead. We rebuilt quickly. You may have heard Chicago's called the second city. That's because the first one burned down. It's basically our second attempt at building Chicago. We rebuilt so well that barely 20 years later we win a bid to host the world